Thanks everyone for joining us for Speaker Night. This is part of our regular Tuesday night at the TR site series. Fourth Tuesdays, Speaker Night gives us an opportunity to think about some of the issues that were important during TR's time, but continue to be important during our time. I would like to thank our sponsors of Speaker Night and indeed the Tuesday Night at the Site series. M&T Bank helped make this possible, as well as the New York State Council on the Arts. We're particularly grateful to New York State Council on the Arts, or NYSCA. They have made it possible for us to record our Speaker Night presentation, so if you've missed a Speaker Night, feel free to go on our YouTube channel and check it out. We're very excited to be able to do that. As I said, we like to look at issues that were important. Among the issues we talk about on our tour, and we also talk about in our programming, our race and social inequity, big business and labor, U.S. as a world power. We talk about a number of issues. Tonight's speaker is David Hochfelder, who's an associate professor at the University of Albany, and he's going to be talking to us kind of a little bit into the big business. He's going to cross a lot of those topics that we like to cover. So we're really excited to have him. Professor Hochfelder is an electrical engineer turned historian. He specializes in the history of U.S. business and technology. He also helps administer New Albany's public history program. And it turns out we know a lot of the same folks around Albany at the various museums. We were talking earlier, and it was kind of interesting, that crossover. Before joining U Albany, Hochfelder served as a research historian at the Thomas Edison Papers. He's the author of The Telegraph in America, 1832 to 1920. And if you recognize him, you might have seen him on several episodes of the History Channel's Modern Marvels series. His next project, I think this is probably where this topic comes from, is about social history of savings and investment. Our topic this evening is Thrift and the Progressive Generation, or why Teddy and Will want you to save your nickels. So without further ado, I'd like to please join me in welcoming Dr. Hochfelder to the TR site.
Thanks, Lenore. I appreciate the welcome. Yes, my current research project is a book provisionally titled Thrift in America from Franklin to the Great Recession. So this is part of the research, very preliminary, but it is part of the research that will wind up hopefully between covers in the not too distant future. I want to start with figuring out the technology. Oh, that's not. You know, I had this figured out before everyone showed up. There we go. I want to start with a couple cylinder phonograph recordings from the presidential campaign of 1908. And I find these fascinating. In 1908, for the first time, the presidential candidates, William Howard Taft, the Republican, and William Jennings Bryan, the Democrat, recorded about a dozen Edison, 3-minute-long Edison cylinder phonograph records, staking out their position on the various political issues of the day. And I want to play you a couple of those cylinder phonograph recordings.
Sorry. Oh, wait, here we go. Sorry.
Bear with us for a second. Okay, and that's number 16.
The people won't realize the evil of insecurity. And there is a growing sentiment in favor of legislation which will guarantee depositors by requiring all banks to stand back with each bank. The government requires security for its deposits. Why should not the individual depositor be protected? You know?
That was it?
That was it?
No, alrighty. Why don't we try, okay, let's go to the other clip from the PowerPoint slide. I think you need to unmute.
New bank system. The government guarantee will bring out of hoarding places much money which may be turned into wealth-producing capital, and will be a great incentive for thrift, with the many small places in the country having now no savings bank facilities which are reached to the post office. It will bring to everyone, however remote from financial centers, a place of perfect safety for deposits with interest return. The pending bill for such banks provides for the investment of the money deposited in national banks in the various places in which it is gathered, or as near thereto as may be practicable. This answers the criticism contained in the Democratic platform that under the system, the money gathered in the country will be deposited in Wall Street banks. The system of postal savings banks has been tried in so many countries successfully that it cannot be regarded longer as a new and untried experiment. The Democratic platform recommends a tax upon national banks and upon such state banks as may come in the nature of enforced insurance to raise the guarantee fund to pay the depositors of any bank which fails. The proposition is to tax the honest and prudent banker to make up for the dishonesty and the imprudence of others. No one can foresee the burden which under this system would be imposed upon the sound and conservative bankers of the country by this obligation to make good the losses caused for the reckless, speculative, and dishonest men who would be enabled to secure deposits under such a system on the face of the proposed insurance. Because, in its present case, the proposal would remove all safeguards against recklessness in banking, and the chief, and in the end probably the only benefit, would accrue to the speculator, who would be delighted to enter the banking business when it was certain that he could enjoy any profit that would accrue, while the risk would have to be assumed by his honest and hard-working fellows. In short, the proposal is wholly impracticable unless it is to be accompanied by a complete revolution in our banking system with a supervision so close as practically to create a government bank. If the proposal were adopted exactly as the Democratic platform suggests, it would bring the whole banking system of the country down in ruin. And this proposal is itself an excellent illustration of the fitness for national control of a party which will commit itself to a scheme of this nature without the slightest sense of responsibility for the practical operation of the law proposed. The Democratic Party announces its adhesion to this plan and only recommends the tried system of postal savings banks as an alternative if the new experimental panacea is not available. The Republican Party prefers the postal savings bank as one tried, safe, and known to be effective, and as reaching many more people now without banking facilities than the new system proposed.
William Sherman, Senator from Ohio, was the author of that. I'm sorry, when it comes to Sherman as the general.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Sorry about that. John Sherman was the senator from Ohio. William Tecumseh Sherman was his brother. And John Sherman was the driving force behind the Antitrust Act. Yes. So basically, let me explain what you just heard on a scratchy cylinder. One of the political issues in the election of 1908 was how to facilitate thrift, or how to encourage people to save. The Republican candidate, William Howard Taft, espoused the creation of a postal savings system. William Jennings Bryan, in his cylinder recording, which unfortunately we did not get to hear much of, and I apologize for that, called that socialistic, that it's the government being paternalistic, and instead advocated for a system of deposit insurance, which in fact would happen in 1933 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president. Now the reason for this, reformers in the 19th century pointed out two things. First of all, they said only about 10% of the American population has a savings account in a bank. This compared unfavorably with European rates. For example, 20% of Italian households or 40% of Swedish households had savings accounts. So the United States lagged behind. In areas like Buffalo, New England, the Northeast, the industrial sections of the country, basically north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi, Savings accounts were very common thanks to savings banks, which were aimed at the working class. And you could deposit as little as a nickel, which is why I had that in the title of my presentation. However, in the rest of the country, especially the rural South and the rural West, savings banks were a very rare phenomenon. So in industrial northern cities, 50% of working class families had roughly savings accounts. But in places like Alabama or Colorado or Nevada, that figure was almost zero. So Taft's idea was to turn every post office into a savings bank. This had been tried since the 1860s in European countries. Great Britain was the first one in 1861, and every other European country followed suit. So that by the election of 1908, most other countries, industrialized countries, had savings banks operated by their postal systems. Okay, so why is this interesting and important outside of the fact that I'm researching it? And I'm fascinated with my research. Let me start with some preliminary observations. First of all, 1908 was the first presidential campaign to use what we would consider the mass media. Now, I'm taking a shortcut here and ignoring the fact that newspapers and magazines are mass media themselves, but I'm talking more about mass media that comes into the home, the phonograph. This is the first election where political, or the major party nominees recorded position statements on a permanent medium like a phonograph record. And this sets, I think this is a real inflection or transition point in how presidential campaigns use the media, and sort of sets the stage for today. Another observation is that we really can't think of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party of today as being at all like those parties in 1908. Their positions were very different, and in some ways they were very similar to each other, but they're very different from the positions parties would take today. The Republican Party tended to be more activist when it came to promoting things like thrift. The Democratic Party tended to be a little more conservative, especially because Southern Democrats were an important part of the party constituency at the time. So in many ways, policy positions were a bit reversed. It's surprising to us today that the Republican candidate would take a very activist stance on something like setting up a postal savings bank, and the Democratic candidate would take a more conservative approach. However, there's convergence. Both candidates thought that some sort of federal action was necessary, or beneficial at least, to encourage households, working class households especially, to put some money aside for a rainy day. Now, I'm not going to belabor you with reading the entire Republican Party platform, but I just want to point out some key provisions. Boilerplate, boilerplate. We favor the establishment of a postal savings bank system for the convenience of the people and the encouragement of thrift. The text up above basically explains the rationale for it. The amelioration of the condition of wage workers everywhere, and then other aspects of economic policy, including trusts, regulating the rates of the railroad lines, and so forth. The Democratic platform, even at this point, now again I said previously that the positions were very different, in some ways they still track true to what we would expect today. The Democratic Party espoused itself as the party of equality before the law, equality of opportunity, and so forth. Their platform called for a postal savings bank only if deposit guarantees could not be secured. Because the Democratic Party, being a more rural party in many respects, feared the concentrated economic power of Wall Street, and that a postal savings system would somehow channel the savings of working class people into the hands of Wall Street speculators. Okay, so what? Why is this an issue in 1908? Before I get to that, let me explain the subsequent history of what happened. Obviously, William Howard Taft wins the presidential election in 1908, becomes president in March 1909. He succeeds in getting a postal savings system set up in 1910. It is a compromise. It's not... several years ago, I would compare this to Obamacare as being basically a compromise that, in the sense that the relevant industries benefited enormously from both pieces of legislation. Let me explain that. The bill was basically a watered-down version of what reformers have been seeking since the 1860s. The idea goes back to President Grant and his first Postmaster General, John A.J. Creswell, who in 1869 and 1870 forcefully advocated for a postal savings system. What eventually winds up happening in 1910 is a postal savings system that pays far less interest than what a depositor would get at a savings bank. Deposits were limited to 2% interest. The account sizes were limited to, I think it was $200 at first, and then gradually increased to $500. And that the money deposited in postal savings banks would get immediately redeposited in commercial banks in the same community. So the banks saw this as a great way to increase their deposit base. So it really was a program that benefited not only the individual depositor and saver, but also benefited the banking industry in some pretty significant ways. So again, a few years ago, I would have used Obamacare as sort of the analogy that, yeah, people benefit from getting access to health insurance, but it's also a boon to the insurance industry. So a lot of American reform efforts throughout our history have that kind of two-edged quality to them. So, okay. What happens after 1910? The working class uses postal savings banks, especially immigrants, even though the deposits are paid out at 2% interest as opposed to 4% at a commercial bank. System works okay. It really reaches its peak in the Great Depression, 1932 and 1933. And then when Franklin Delano Roosevelt takes office, he immediately declares a bank holiday. And one of the things FDR does is return to Bryan's idea of the guarantee of bank deposits. And that happens. The FDIC is set up. Bank deposits are guaranteed by the federal government. The leading rationale for a postal savings bank under the American model then goes away. And the postal savings system winds its affairs up under President Lyndon Johnson in the mid-1960s. But why this is significant? Thrift is really, thrift word, let me explain what I mean by thrift. What I mean is the idea that ordinary people, working class people, should have access to a means to save their money is a really recent idea. It only goes back a couple hundred years. Now this is an apocryphal quote because I've not found an original sourcing for this that satisfies me. But I've seen it all over the place in 19th century reformers' publications. And it's this, that in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, when Lord Wellington was mustering out his troops, one of his regimental colonels came to him and asked for him to set up an army savings bank, a regimental savings bank for the troops mustering out, something to do with their pay. And Wellington reportedly replied something along the lines of, has a British soldier too much pay? If so, then it should be lowered to those who enlist thereafter. Now, we can make what we want about Wellington's kind of callous remark, but this idea that ordinary people, soldiers in the King's army in Great Britain, should have access to a means to save their pay was a really new idea. The idea was, Wellington's response was, well, it sounds like they have too much money. So it's only around 1820 when reformers in Great Britain especially, and also the United States, begin thinking about ways to alleviate poverty. And one of the solutions they hit upon is giving the working poor a means to save their money at interest. So thrift, that is, the availability for working class people to save money for the future, relies on some pretty key foundations. The first is interest. And interest is really impossible without something else, and that's continual economic growth. It makes no sense to pay interest on bank deposits unless the economy is growing. So perpetual economic growth is one of the underpinnings to access for working class people to save their money. The second is this idea that thrift is the means to alleviate poverty. Self-help, in other words, is the means to alleviate poverty. The third kind of precondition or foundation for thrift is having cash. A lot of people in the era of the American Revolution, especially in the West, and the West includes Western Massachusetts at this time, talked a lot about money because no one had it. A lot of economic transactions happened in kind or through simple bookkeeping. But the more you see letters and diaries talking about cash, the the less cash that actually circulated in a given community. So 3 things. Interest, the idea of thrift as self-help, and interest relying on perpetual economic growth. The idea of thrift as self-help to alleviate poverty, and ready access to cash among large segments of the population. Those 3 preconditions don't happen until about 1820. Around 1820, in the United States and Great Britain, philanthropists set up savings banks aimed at the working class. They're run as charities at first, with bank officers receiving no pay and very little in the way of state oversight. That happens gradually, and then these banks gradually become commercial enterprises. But savings banks persist well into the 20th century and then ultimately become savings and loans. One of the leading examples of this is the Freedmen's Savings Bank set up by the Union Army in 1865. When African American troops were mustering out, they would receive a mustering out bonus in cash. And as soon as they left the paymaster's table to receive their cash, there would be a host of people, sutlers is the term usually referred to, that these people are usually referred to as, who attempted to get them to spend their money on things like alcohol, gambling, fancy things, and so forth. So Union Army commanders set up a system of Army savings banks to help mustering out troops deposit their money. This morphs into what becomes the Freedmen's Savings Bank, chartered by an act of Congress in 1865, and was the last piece of legislation signed by President Lincoln before his assassination. At first, the savings banks worked great. Tens of thousands of African Americans throughout the South deposit their money, and then the Panic of 1873 hits. The economy crashes. In 1874, the Freedmen's Savings Bank goes bankrupt. Almost everyone who deposited money loses their money. Only a minority of the savers only receive about 60 cents on the dollar back in the 1890s, when many of them were quite elderly, and many more of them had died. So I talked a little bit about postal saving systems. The context here is the post office reaches everyone. Why not use the post office as a means to encourage people to deposit their savings? During the Civil War and the 2 World Wars, the United States government resorts to novel financing methods, that is, marketing war bonds to individual savers at very small denominations. This is a new thing under the sun. And then in the 20th century, there's a shift away from safer forms of saving like government bonds and passbook savings accounts into riskier forms of saving, that is, investing in stocks or using your home as a source of equity. And I'll talk about that by way of conclusion. This is a newspaper advertisement for a savings bank from a mill town in New England, and I want to point out a couple features of this. First of all, the bank took deposits as small as 5 cents. Actually, it's an ad for 2 savings banks. But again, the same thing, taking deposits as small as 5 cents. Another feature not shown in this ad is that savings banks were open in the evenings and on Saturdays for the convenience of the working class who could not take time off from their jobs at the mill or the foundry or the factory to go to the bank, even on their very short lunch breaks. So these savings banks catering to the working class had evening and weekend hours. These are passbooks from the Freedmen's Savings Bank. There are about 36 branches operating throughout the South and in some northern cities such as Baltimore, Philadelphia, and even New York City. Interestingly enough, the New York City Freedmen's Savings Bank had a lot of Irish immigrant depositors. On the inside cover of the Freedmen's Savings Bank passbook, there was verbiage about the virtues of thrift. The passbook also advertised the fact that Abraham Lincoln personally signed the legislation enabling the bank. This was obviously of great appeal to the freed people. This also stressed that the deposits were entirely safe, which turned out not to be true for a very long story, which I will not get into in my discussion, my presentation. And of course, as an encouragement to thrift, the passbook showed how your savings could grow. If you deposited 10 cents a day in 1 year, you would have $37. That amount would grow to somewhere in the $400 range in 10 years. People were also exhorted to give up bad habits like alcohol and tobacco and to use that money saved in order to deposit that money in a savings account and save for a rainy day. Now, as I said, in 1874, the Freedmen's Savings Bank went bankrupt. W.E.B. Du Bois famously remarked after the turn of the 20th century that that setback did more damage to African American economic opportunity than an additional 10 years of slavery would have done. And it wasn't until well after the turn of the 20th century that many African Americans would again trust banks. This is a postal savings certificate. As I alluded to, the system started in Great Britain, spread throughout Europe, and the United States was the only country in 1909 that did not have a postal savings system. In the US, it operated until 1967. Postal savings system also facilitated small savings amounts. This is a card, and what you would do is you would buy 10-cent stamps, savings stamps, paste them onto this piece of cardboard, and when you got 10 stamps on there equaling $1, you would take that to the post office, and you would deposit that dollar. This model also functioned during World War I under the guise of thrift stamps and war savings stamps, where school children or people of modest means could do the same thing. Put a 10-cent stamp on a piece of cardboard, and when $1 or $5 or $10 was accumulated, you would take that and deposit that piece of cardboard with the stamps on it and buy a war bond, or at least an installment on a victory bond. This is one of my favorite parts about the postal savings card. This is the other side of the slide you just saw with the room for the 10 stamps. Note how many languages are on this card. Italian, Greek, Spanish, French, German, Polish, Hungarian, Swedish, Danish, Yiddish, Bohemian, Lithuanian, Croatian, Slovak, Bulgarian, Finnish, Russian, Slovenian, Ruthenian, Serbian, Portuguese, Romanian, Chinese, Japanese. Why do you think there were so many languages on this card? Immigrants. The postal savings system was very popular with immigrants for two important reasons. The first was they were used to it from their home countries and regarded it as a safe form of savings. They tended not to trust, there were so-called immigrant banks, especially in New York City and San Francisco, that tended to prey on immigrants and promise them, almost like a Ponzi scheme, promise them vast amounts of interest. And a lot of people lost their money. So immigrants tended to distrust commercial banks and patronize the postal savings system very heavily. The other reason was they could use their savings in the postal savings system to send postal money orders back to their families in their home countries. Now, another aspect of the history of thrift that I find fascinating is war bonds during the Civil War and the two world wars. Before the Civil War, when the United States financed its debt, that is, issued bonds, it generally sold those bonds in large chunks to wealthy European bankers. And that worked great for quite a while. And then in 1861 and 1862, in the midst of the Civil War, it turns out the Civil War is not going very well for the North until 1863, militarily and even politically. So the federal government is trying to market its bonds and finds that it can't sell its bonds except at interest rates of over 10%. And that is just too much of a price to pay. So Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase contacts the Philadelphia banker Jay Cook and says, "Oh, Mr. Cook, you had great success in marketing Pennsylvania state bonds. Couldn't you do the same for Treasury, U.S. Treasury bonds?" And Cook says, "Sure, but I don't think we should try and go to Europe and do this. That's not going to work out very well. Why don't we do this instead? I'll set up a network of agents, several thousand of them, around the country, and we'll sell the bonds. We'll basically go door to door. We'll advertise the bonds in $25 and $50 increments. And that works great. And the United States government is able to pay 5% or 7% interest, which is about half of what they would have had to, the government would have had to pay in the international bond market. Jay Cook sells about $1 billion, somewhere just short of $1 billion, in 1860s dollars. And it's estimated that about a quarter of northern households bought government bonds during the Civil War. And Jay Cook's slogan was perfectly sensible. He said, "Make the government your savings bank." Obviously, patriotic motives were part of that, but he also used enlightened self-interest. Make the government your savings bank. During World War I, the same thing. About 22 million families bought about $21 billion worth of Liberty bonds during the war and immediately afterward. In World War II, again, the Victory loans raised, I don't have the figure, but a comparable figure. Now what's noteworthy about the Civil War is that Jay Cook's bond drives took place without any of what we would consider modern necessities for conducting a major bond drive. There were no movie stars, there were no professional athletes, there were no movies, there was no mass media. Jay Cook did this by going door to door and advertising in bank windows. Now during World War I, things were a little more coercive than Jay Cook's "Make the government your savings bank" slogan. Treasury Secretary William McAdoo famously said two things. Every person who refuses to subscribe, that is, who refuses to buy a Liberty bond, is a friend of Germany and not entitled to be an American citizen. A man who can't lend his government $1.25 per week at a rate of 4% interest is not entitled to be an American citizen. Now even school children got out of the act. This is from the New York State Archives. And this shows a school group in Cortland, New York, 8th grade class, who sold $1,100 in war savings stamps, which then became converted into Liberty bonds. Poster art, if anyone has seen the exhibit at the Buffalo Historical Society on World War I, there's a lot of great poster art from World War I, kind of the peak of poster art. So I'll just show you a few of these that advertised the Liberty loans. This is actor Douglas Fairbanks in the spring of 1918, addressing a huge crowd in New York City to sell war bonds. And here again, Jay Cook did this during the Civil War without a Douglas Fairbanks, or without a Jack Dempsey. But you get a sense of the mass culture of celebrity that the federal government tapped into in order to sell war bonds. During World War II, of course, bond drives began to include veterans more heavily. So for example, the Memphis Belle, the B-17 bomber and its crew, was recruited to sell war bonds. And those of you who've seen Flags of Our Fathers know that the flag raisers in Iwo Jima also went around the country selling war bonds during World War II. Now World War I really marked the peak of the pro-thrift movement in the United States. You would see, again, resurgences during World War II, but really the progressive era was the peak of this movement for thrift. And the reasons for this, especially during World War I, raising money for national defense, but also more progressive virtues like self-reliance, creating a pool of national capital for investing in businesses and infrastructure. Also very closely fit with the progressive goals of efficiency and conservation. And you hear a lot of people talking about thrift as a way to conserve resources or to use resources more efficiently. And progressives also had sort of a heavy-handed approach in many ways, and they targeted groups they considered particularly spendthrift, immigrants and school children especially. And here's a calendar from the Germania Savings Bank in New York City explaining why you should save and basically it's prepare for old age. And what I find interesting is who's responsible for working class economic security? Is it the individual, is it the employer, or is it the government? And how has that threefold relationship changed over time? In the 19th century, thrift was a way to success in life. On the left-hand side, the result of saving is a happy family, prosperous family, Result of spending on the right is misery and destitution. This really begins with Horatio Alger's story Ragged Dick, which is about a homeless shoeshine boy making his way in New York City. Ragged Dick becomes Richard Hunter Esquire after he opens his first savings account when he gets a $5 windfall after one of his adventures. And instead of spending the money at the Bowery Theater and then sleeping on the streets like he ordinarily would have, he decides to rent a room in a house for a couple dollars and take the rest of that money and deposit it in the savings bank. And then he begins to become respectable and middle class. School children, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, one of their major activities, directed by Sarah Louise Oberholzer in this photograph, a Philadelphia philanthropist, was to set up school savings bank in the schools. Teachers would basically take deposits on Thursday or Friday, record the deposits, bring the deposits to a local savings bank, and deposit them for the school children. And Sarah Louise Oberholzer basically said, I'm quoting here, in justifying this activity as a pro-temperance activity, that school savings bears most directly on the temperance cause. When boys and girls are taught thrift and self-reliance, they are not likely to become criminals or drunkards. All right, so what happened? Why don't we think of thrift in these ways anymore as national efficiency and conservation and a means to build up a national reservoir of capital for investing in infrastructure projects? Why don't we think of thrift as the means to prosperity or a way to avoid drunkenness or crime? And a lot happens in the 1920s. We think of the 1920s as a decade of consumerism, and that's true to a large extent. It's not true in other ways, but for shorthand purposes, let's take that as read. A lot of things happen. Motion pictures become more popular. Professional athletics become more popular. Installment buying becomes something that facilitates consumers buying expensive appliances like washing machines, radio sets, and automobiles. Obviously, during the Great Depression and World War II, nobody is saving money, especially during the Depression. During World War II, people are buying war bonds, but there's a lot of pent-up consumer demand after World War II ends. Also, after World War II, and especially in the last generation, people have moved their savings out of formerly safe forms of saving like life insurance policies, passbook savings, and into more riskier forms of saving like stock investing and treating your home as a source of home equity. Also, a lot goes on sort of behind the scenes among academics, especially economists. John Maynard Keynes is the first to identify, or not the first to identify, but the first to call it this, the paradox of thrift. And that is, if everyone saves their money, no one's spending money, and consumption doesn't happen, aggregate demand goes down, and the economy goes into a recession. So on the individual level, savings makes sense, but on the collective level, in many ways, it does not. And of course, the marginal propensity to consume, which is the less money you have, the more likely you are to spend whatever money you take in, as opposed to saving it. This is from 1926. Let me check that in my notes. Yes, in 1926, Albert R. Erskine, president of Studebaker Motors, urged Americans to spend and grow rich. And this is the illustration from that article that Mr. Erskine wrote in Literary Review in 1926. And he noted that in 1925, Americans bought $4.5 billion worth of consumer goods on installment, including $3 billion worth of automobiles. He claimed that nearly all the wealth produced since the turn of the century had been, quote, created on credit. Erskine said further, the real thrift dictates the expansion of credit so that the economies of mass production may be realized. At the same time, he claimed that installment buying actually encouraged thrift because people had the same kind of savings mentality when paying off a car or a washing machine or a radio set. At the same time, he said that what's becoming more and more important, and again, this is a direct quote, is the value of a good credit standing. Now, I would wager today that your credit score is probably just as important to your financial future as the amount of money you have in a savings account. Okay, I'm not going to take you through the history of stock investing. Suffice it to say that in the 19th century, a lot of people wanted to invest in stocks, but couldn't because you had to buy stocks in 100 share lots and no one could afford that. This changes around the turn of the century for a variety of reasons. People begin buying stocks, but not very intelligently. This is a cartoon from a magazine called The Ticker, showing a haphazard investor in the upper left buying, quote, any old thing, and a responsible investor actually going through annual reports and financial statements. In 1928, about 18 million people owned stocks. This is actually an inflated figure because if you own stocks in 3 different companies, you were counted 3 times. But suffice it to say that as a share of the population, stock ownership was quite low up until the past couple generations. Today, over half of households own stocks, mainly through mutual funds or other easy vehicles for buying stock. Buying stock today is really easy, and it was not in 1900. You had to buy a 100 share lot or go into what were called bucket shops and gamble on the price movements of particular stocks and commodities. This is from just before the Great Recession. This is 2007, showing how people have begun treating their homes as piggy banks. And the headline, or the text reads, for much of this decade, homeowners eagerly tapped the equity in their homes, but that borrowing has dropped sharply in recent months because we were on the verge of the Great Recession. But no one knew it in November 2007. So to wrap up, as I alluded to a second before, it's probably likely that your credit score is equally important to your financial well-being and financial future as how much money you have in a passbook savings account. How many people still have a passbook savings account? Because they pay 0% interest relative. Matter of fact, you would lose money if you took inflation into account. How many people have stocks? Okay. How many people have taken home equity loans out? Good, good, don't do that. I'm not a financial advisor, I'm just a historian. So my research really hinges on 2 central questions. One is, if the American dream is widespread access to material prosperity, that is, a decent standard of living for every household, whose responsibility is it to ensure a decent standard of living? Is it the individuals in the household? Is it the employer? And we see a lot of forms of welfare capitalism during the 20th and 21st centuries, including benefits like health insurance or pensions or retirement accounts. Or is it also partly the business of the government to ensure working class economic security? Now, related to that, I'm interested in how that 3-cornered relationship has changed over time. And I would conclude by saying that what makes American capitalism unique is in fact this very question. How is working class economic security, or to put it more generally, a decent standard of living for every household, how has that desire shaped the way that American capitalism is different from capitalism in other parts of the world? Hopefully within a few years I'll be able to have an answer between actual book covers. But those are the questions driving my research that I've shared with you tonight. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions.